Have you ever felt like you're fighting against an invisible current, trying to hold on to someone in your life when everything around you seems to conspire to push them away? Have you noticed that no matter how hard you try, certain relationships become increasingly burdensome, like carrying stones on your shoulders with every conversation, every meeting, every attempt at reconciliation that seems to lead nowhere? This pain you feel is real. This confusion that dwells in your heart when you question whether to persevere or let go isn't weakness, it's profoundly human. You are not alone in this silent battle waged deep within your soul, where the love you feel for someone clashes with the peace you so desperately seek. Millions of people around the world experience this same anguish, questioning whether they're being selfish by considering distancing themselves from someone they love, or whether they're being foolish by remaining in situations that drain their life force. Billy Graham, one of the greatest evangelists in modern history, deeply understood this struggle. He knew that God, in His infinite wisdom, sometimes calls us to let go of people we love, not out of cruelty, but out of love. Just as Abraham was called to leave his homeland for the unknown, just as Ruth had to choose between returning to her family or following Naomi into an uncertain future, Jesus himself had to distance himself from the crowds who followed him when he perceived they sought him for the wrong reasons. There are times in our lives when the divine gently whispers that it's time to release, time to allow certain people to follow their own paths. This isn't merely a psychological or emotional issue, it's a profound spiritual battle fought in the invisible realms of the human heart. It's about spiritual discernment, about learning to distinguish between love that liberates and attachment that imprisons, between loyalty that honors God and emotional dependence that pulls us away from our true purpose. It's about recognizing that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is to allow them to find their own way, even if it means walking alone for a while. Looking to the scriptures, we see countless examples of relationships that needed to be transformed or ended for God's greater plan to be fulfilled. Moses had to leave Egypt and everything he knew. David faced betrayal from those closest to him. Paul had disagreements with Barnabas, his ministry partner. Jesus himself said that he came not to bring peace, but a sword, referring to the divisions his truth would cause, even within families. This doesn't mean God desires our pain, but that He is more interested in our spiritual growth and eternal destiny than in our temporary convenience. The first sign that God may be trying to remove someone from your life is when you begin to feel a constant unease in your spirit whenever you're in that person's presence. It's not just discomfort or an occasional disagreement, it's something deeper, a disquiet that seems to come from a sacred place within you. It's as if your soul is trying to tell you something your mind isn't yet ready to accept. You may try to rationalize these feelings, you may try to convince yourself that you're overreacting or being too sensitive, but this inner voice persists, whispering truths your heart recognizes even when your head rejects them. This spiritual unease is different from the normal conflict that exists in any human relationship. It's a feeling that something is fundamentally out of sync, as if you're singing different melodies, walking in opposite directions, even when you're trying to be together. It's the sense that this person, however much you love them, is somehow hindering your spiritual growth, your connection with God, your sense of inner peace. You may love this person deeply and still feel that their constant presence in your life is creating static in your line of communication with the divine. When Elijah was fleeing Jezebel, he experienced this kind of spiritual unease. He knew he needed to distance himself, not just physically, but spiritually, from influences that were trying to silence God's voice in his life. Sometimes God removes us from certain people not because they are bad, but because our souls need space to hear His voice clearly. It's impossible to discern God's will when we're constantly bombarded by human voices that, consciously or unconsciously, pull us away from our spiritual center. You may notice that after spending time with this person, you feel spiritually exhausted, as if your life force has been drained. You may find it difficult to pray after talking to them, or you may feel a spiritual fog that makes it hard to connect with God. Your values may begin to blur. You may find yourself questioning things that were once clear to you, not in a healthy way of growth, but in a way that creates confusion and distance from your true self. This first sign is often the subtlest, but also the most important. It's God speaking through your spirit, trying to protect you from influences that may be sabotaging your spiritual growth. Like a shepherd who knows his sheep and knows when wolves are approaching, even in disguise, the Holy Spirit within you recognizes when certain presences are not beneficial to your spiritual journey. Learning to trust this inner discernment is one of the most valuable skills a believer can develop. The second sign manifests when you realize your values, principles, and life direction are in constant conflict with this person. This isn't just a difference of opinion on trivial matters, it's a fundamental divergence on issues that touch the core of who you are and what you believe. It's like you're trying to build a house together, but one wants to use bricks while the other insists on straw. No matter how hard you try, the structure will always be unstable because the foundations are incompatible. You might notice this person consistently discourages your deepest dreams, especially those you feel are a calling from God. Maybe they don't do it maliciously or overtly, but there's always a shadow of doubt they cast over your most sacred aspirations. When you talk about your plans to serve God in a specific way, about changes you feel you need to make to grow spiritually, or about directions you feel God is calling you to follow, this person finds ways to discourage you, to plant seeds of doubt, or to make you feel foolish for having faith in bigger possibilities. This conflict of direction isn't just about big life decisions, it manifests in the small daily choices too. Maybe you're trying to develop healthier habits, physically, emotionally, or spiritually, and this person constantly undermines those efforts. Maybe you're trying to spend more time in prayer, Bible study, or community service, and this person always finds ways to interrupt or discourage these practices. It's as if there's a subtle but persistent force working against your growth whenever this person is around. Remember how Nehemiah faced constant opposition from Sanballat and Tobiah while trying to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem? They didn't attack directly. They used subtler tactics: discouragement, distraction, planting seeds of doubt. Sometimes the people God is trying to remove from our lives operate in the same way. They may not be overtly hostile, but there's always an energy working against God's purposes for your life. You may notice that when you're with this person, you feel less confident about who you are in Christ. Your identity as a child of God seems to become hazy. Your gifts and talents seem less significant. Your faith feels less solid. This happens because some people, even without malicious intent, carry an energy that's not aligned with God's kingdom, and that energy can interfere with your spiritual connection. The third sign is when you realize that no matter how much you invest in this relationship, it remains one-sided and emotionally draining. It's like you're constantly watering a plant that never blooms, continually feeding a flame that never produces enough heat to warm you. You find yourself always initiating conversations, making plans, worrying about the other person's well-being, forgiving, adapting, sacrificing, without receiving the same kind of care and consideration in return. This imbalance isn't just about giving and receiving in a material sense. It's about emotional and spiritual investment. You realize you're constantly worrying about this person, praying for them, trying to understand them, making concessions to accommodate them, while they seem unable or unwilling to make the same kind of investment in you. It's as if you're the only one aware that there's a relationship that needs nurturing. This pattern can be especially painful because it often starts subtly. In the beginning, you may have felt useful, needed, important to this person. You may have interpreted this neediness as love or as a sign that you have a special connection. But over time, you realize the dynamic doesn't evolve. The person doesn't grow in their capacity for reciprocity. They don't develop the ability to offer emotional support, genuine encouragement, or to be present for you in the same way you are present for them. Jesus faced this with the 12. He invested deeply in each of them, but not all reciprocated with the same level of commitment and love. Judas is the most obvious example, but even Peter, John, and James, those closest to him, sometimes failed to offer the emotional and spiritual support he needed. The difference is that Jesus knew from the beginning that his purpose wasn't to receive, but to give. But for us, limited humans, healthy relationships require mutuality to be sustainable in the long run. You might notice that your conversations with this person always revolve around their problems, needs, and dramas. When you try to share your own struggles, joys, or concerns, the conversation quickly shifts back to them. When you need support, they're unavailable or offer superficial advice that shows they didn't really understand or care enough to understand your situation. When you have good news to share, they may seem uncomfortable or quickly change the subject. If you're connecting with our journey so far, consider subscribing to our channel to continue receiving reflections that can illuminate your spiritual walk. Sometimes the deepest truths reach us when we least expect them, and together we can discover God's whispers amidst the complexities of human life. This kind of one-sided relationship can leave you feeling emotionally starved, even when you're constantly feeding the other person. It's like trying to fill a leaky bucket. No matter how much you pour in, it never fills, and you exhaust yourself in the process. God doesn't call us to relationships that consistently leave us empty and drained. He calls us to relationships that may have seasons of giving more than receiving, but that over time offer mutuality, mutual growth, and reciprocal edification. The fourth sign emerges when you realize this person consistently attempts to control, manipulate, or define who you should be, especially in ways that contradict what you feel God is calling you to be. This control can be subtle, masked as care, concern, or knowing what's best for you. It might come disguised as constant advice, constructive criticism that always leaves you feeling inadequate, or expectations that seem impossible to meet. This person may have a very specific vision of how your life should be, and constantly works, consciously or unconsciously, to mold you according to that vision. They might struggle to accept your independent decisions, especially those that indirectly affect them. They might use guilt, fear, or emotional blackmail to influence your choices. They might have difficulty respecting your boundaries and constantly test or completely ignore them. Control can manifest in various ways. It could be through constant criticism that undermines your self-confidence. It could be through jealousy of your other relationships, trying to isolate you from friends, family, or mentors they perceive as threats to their influence over you. It could be through subtle sabotage of your successes, always finding ways to diminish your accomplishments or attributing them to external factors instead of recognizing your own merits and efforts. Remember how King Saul tried to control David even when it became clear that God had chosen David to lead Israel. Saul couldn't accept that David had a calling and a destiny beyond Saul's control. He repeatedly tried to manipulate, control, and even destroy David because David's independent existence threatened Saul's sense of power and control. Sometimes people in our lives operate with the same dynamic. They can't tolerate our spiritual and emotional independence because it threatens their sense of importance or control. You might notice that this person has difficulty genuinely celebrating your successes. When good things happen in your life, especially things that demonstrate your growth, independence, or God's favor, they might respond with passive-aggressive comments, by redirecting attention to their own problems, or with negative predictions about why this good thing won't last. It's as if they'd prefer you to remain in a position of dependence or inferiority to them. Control can also manifest through constant attempts to define your relationships with other people. This person might have strong opinions about who you should or shouldn't spend time with, what advice you should or shouldn't follow, what opportunities you should or shouldn't accept. They might use your shared history, your emotional needs, or even spiritual manipulation. God showed me this isn't good for you, to try to influence your decisions. This type of control is especially toxic because it often comes masked as love or concern. The person may genuinely believe they're acting in your best interest, but true love respects free will. True love trusts that God is working in the other person's life and doesn't try to replace God's voice with their own. True love encourages growth and independence, even when it means the dynamics of the relationship will change.
The fifth and perhaps most definitive sign is when you realize this person not only fails to support your spiritual growth, but actively hinders or sabotages it. This can happen in obvious or subtle ways. It could be through mockery or disdain for your faith. It could be through constant attempts to involve you in activities, conversations, or situations you know aren't beneficial to your soul. It could be through pressure to compromise your values or ignore your conscience. This person might consistently discourage you from spiritual practices that are important to you: prayer, Bible study, church attendance, Christian service. They might make jokes about your faith, question your convictions in ways that aren't constructive, or try to convince you that you're being extreme or too religious. They might always have an emergency or urgent need precisely when you've planned time for spiritual practices. More subtly, this person might drain your spiritual energy through constant drama, persistent negativity, or obsessive focus on worldly problems and worries. They might create an emotional environment that makes it difficult for you to maintain inner peace, gratitude, or faith. It's as if their presence casts a cloud that obscures your ability to see God's goodness and blessings in your life. Jesus said we can recognize a tree by its fruit. If someone in your life consistently produces fruit of confusion, discouragement, doubt, fear, or distance from God, that's a clear sign that this person may not be aligned with God's purposes for your life. This doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad person. It might simply mean you're in different seasons of your spiritual journeys, or that there are unresolved issues interfering with your ability to have a healthy relationship. You might notice that after spending time with this person, you feel less connected to God, less confident in your faith, less motivated to grow spiritually. You might find excuses not to pray, not to read the Bible, not to participate in church activities. You might start questioning convictions that were once solid, not in a healthy way of growth and refinement, but in a way that breeds doubt and confusion. It's important to distinguish between people who challenge your faith in constructive ways and people who sabotage your faith. God can use others to refine our beliefs, to help us think more deeply about our faith, to encourage us to grow beyond spiritual superficialities. But there's a difference between constructive challenge and destructive sabotage. Constructive challenge comes from love and results in growth. Destructive sabotage comes from fear, control, or spiritual incompatibility and results in confusion and setbacks. When you recognize these signs in your own life, it's important to remember that the answer isn't always abruptly cutting people off. Sometimes God is calling you to set clearer boundaries, to reduce the amount of influence that person has over you, or to change the nature of the relationship rather than ending it completely. Sometimes what seems like a call to remove someone from your life is actually a call to transform the relationship dynamic. The discernment process requires time, prayer, and often wise counsel from mature spiritual mentors. It's important to examine your own motives and ensure you're not simply trying to avoid legitimate responsibilities or escape opportunities for personal growth that might come through challenging relationships. Sometimes God uses difficult people in our lives to teach us patience, unconditional love, or forgiveness. Other times, He calls us to distance ourselves from influences that are hindering our spiritual growth. The key is learning to distinguish between the two. Relationships that are challenging but result in mutual growth, that respect healthy boundaries, that encourage your walk with God even when there are conflicts or differences, are relationships worth preserving and working on. Relationships that consistently drain your spiritual energy, sabotage your growth, disrespect your core values, or require you to compromise who you are in Christ to maintain peace may be relationships God is calling you to step away from. Remember that true love sometimes requires letting go. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to allow that person to face the consequences of their own choices without your constant interference. Sometimes your continued presence in someone's life might even be preventing that person from growing, learning important lessons, or developing their own relationship with God. Consider the story of the prodigal son. The father had to let his son go, even knowing the son would likely make destructive choices. But it was only when the son experienced the consequences of his own decisions that he could arrive at genuine repentance and return home. Had the father continued to protect him from consequences, the son might never have learned the lessons he needed to learn. Similarly, sometimes our constant willingness to rescue, support, or tolerate destructive behaviors in others may be preventing them from growing. Our well-intentioned loyalty may be becoming an obstacle to God's plan in those people's lives. In these cases, stepping away can be an act of love for both ourselves and them. The process of distancing yourself from someone you love is never easy. There will be pain, guilt, doubt, and moments when you'll question whether you're doing the right thing. It's important to remember that feeling pain doesn't mean you're making the wrong decision. Sometimes the rightest decisions are also the hardest. Jesus felt pain when he had to distance himself from the crowds who followed him for the wrong reasons. Paul felt pain when he had to separate from Barnabas. David felt pain when he had to flee from Saul, even knowing it was necessary for his protection and the fulfillment of God's plan. The pain you feel when you distance yourself from someone can actually be a sign that you're doing something significant and right. If it were easy, if there were no emotional cost, it might not be a decision that requires faith and courage. The most important decisions in our lives are rarely the easiest.
During this process, it's crucial to stay connected with God through prayer, Bible study, and fellowship with other mature believers. You'll need supernatural wisdom to navigate difficult conversations, to set boundaries with love, and to remain firm in your decisions even when facing pressure to change your mind. You'll need God's strength to resist the guilt, fear, and questioning that will surely come. It's also important to remember that distancing yourself from someone doesn't mean stopping loving that person or stopping praying for them. You can continue to intercede for them, wish them well, and even help them in ways that don't compromise your own spiritual and emotional health. Love doesn't always require constant physical or emotional proximity. Sometimes, love requires distance that allows both people to grow and become who God has called them to be. Think about how Jesus loved Judas to the end, even knowing Judas would betray him. Jesus didn't stop loving Judas, but he also didn't allow Judas's behavior to prevent him from fulfilling his mission. Similarly, you can love someone and still recognize that person can't be part of your journey in the way you've related up to this point. When you make the decision to distance yourself from someone, it's important to do so with as much integrity as possible. This may mean having difficult but honest conversations about why you need space. It may mean setting clear boundaries about what kind of contact you're willing to maintain. It may mean being transparent about your needs and expectations, even when it's uncomfortable. Remember, you are not responsible for controlling how another person reacts to your decision. You are only responsible for acting with love, honesty, and integrity. If the person responds with anger, manipulation, or attempts to guilt you, that might actually confirm you're making the right choice. People who truly love you will respect your needs, even when it's difficult for them. The period after separating from a significant other can be a season of profound spiritual growth, but it can also be a season of loneliness and questioning. It's important to use this time wisely, to strengthen your relationship with God, to cultivate healthy relationships with others, to develop your gifts and talents, and to seek healing for emotional wounds that may have developed during toxic relationships. Sometimes God removes people from our lives to make room for better people. Sometimes He removes relationships that are consuming all our emotional energy so we can invest in relationships that are more aligned with His purposes for our lives. Sometimes He removes distractions so we can focus on our calling and purpose. Trust that God has a plan. Trust that He knows what's best for you, even when you can't see the bigger picture. Trust that He can use even difficult and painful relationships to shape you and prepare you for what He has in store for your future. Trust that He is able to bring healing, restoration, and even better relationships in His perfect timing. Remember that this journey of discerning relationships is part of the sanctification process. God is constantly working to conform us to the image of His Son, and that includes teaching us to develop healthy relationships, to set appropriate boundaries, and to discern between influences that draw us closer to Him and influences that pull us away from Him. This process isn't about becoming cold or unloving.
It's about becoming a wise person who understands that not all relationships are meant to last forever, that not everyone is ready for the depth of connection you desire, and that preserving your spiritual and emotional health isn't selfish, it's stewardship of what God has entrusted to you. Your life, your energy, your capacity to love and serve, these are all gifts from God that must be nurtured and protected. You have a responsibility to be a good steward of these gifts, which sometimes means saying no to relationships that drain or compromise them. As you navigate this journey, remember that you are not alone. God is with you, guiding you, strengthening you, and preparing you for the future He has for you. Other believers have also gone through similar struggles and can offer wisdom, encouragement, and practical support. The Christian community exists to help us carry burdens that are too heavy to carry alone. Finally, remember that God is a God of redemption and restoration. Even relationships that need to be ended or transformed can be redeemed in the future if both people grow and change. Don't close the door completely on the possibility of restoration, but also don't let that hope prevent you from making healthy decisions in the present. There is freedom in recognizing that you cannot save, fix, or change other people. There is peace in accepting that you can only control your own choices and reactions. There is power in deciding that you will honor God with your relational decisions even when those decisions are difficult and unpopular. God has a beautiful plan for your life, a plan that includes relationships that glorify Him, that encourage your growth, that support your calling, and that bring genuine joy to your heart. Sometimes, to make room for those relationships, He needs to remove relationships that no longer serve His purpose for you. Trust Him. Trust the process. Trust that He knows what is best, even when it's painful. Trust that He is working all things together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. As you reflect on these truths, ask yourself, which relationships in my life are aligned with God's purposes for me, and which might be hindering my spiritual growth? Which voices in my life draw me closer to God and which pull me away from Him? Where might I be holding on to relationships out of fear, guilt, or habit instead of genuine mutual edification and divine purpose? The path isn't easy, but it is liberating. The journey isn't without pain, but it is transformative. And in the end, when you look back, you will see that every difficult decision you made in obedience to God's voice brought you closer to the man or woman He always intended you to be. You will see that every relationship you had the courage to transform or end made room for deeper, more meaningful connections, more aligned with God's heart for your life. The question remains, will you have the courage to hear when God whispers that it's time to let go? Will you have the faith to trust that He has something better in store? And will you have the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone and for ourselves is to allow both of you to follow the paths God has laid out for your lives, even if those paths don't intersect in the way we once hoped?